Hi, folks. Welcome to this week's lecture on process evaluations, where we're going to talk about process evaluations. So that should be pretty simple and straightforward. Last week, we did talk about preliminary evaluations, which are used to answer questions such as what needs to be done or what is being done, who's doing what should we do, what factors will impact what we do, and so on and so forth. We talked about lots of methods that can be used, from document review to task analysis, jurisdictional scan, and the scenarios in which some of those tools might be useful to you as an evaluator. Today we're going to talk about, as I said, process evaluations. These answer questions about what does the program look like, or how does an intervention work, what intervention is being delivered, is it the same as the intervention that you plan to deliver, and what changes did you make? Because you can imagine with many of the programs that you're looking at implementing as part of your projects for this class, and for any project that you will probably implement in your career, it will oftentimes be based on something that has been done somewhere else. And so you can imagine that when you bring something, say from Toronto, to BC, or from BC to Alberta, or from Alberta to Ottawa, when you change the location and the context and the organization that's responsible for it, you're changing a major component of the program. Sometimes these changes are not necessarily significant to how the program works, to the theory of change that guides and determines your model, but sometimes they are. And so fidelity is this concept that aims to assess, how well does it the program that you're evaluating match the program that you kind of promised to deliver on. And so that's an important thing to consider, because let's take something like safe consumption sites, which we'll use again as an example later in the lecture. You can imagine that if you implement and set up a safe consumption site, or and it has a needle exchange element or something like that, that might be evidence based in one area. But say you bring it to a new area and you say, okay, well, we do safe consumption, but we only do it for safe injection and not for snorting. And so therefore you've changed the program. And so any evaluations that you do based on that program should be specified to relate to your new program and not necessarily to the overall idea of safe consumption sites. And so that's an important lesson to learn, because as we're comparing programs across various jurisdictions, or scaling up programs or expanding them, we're making fundamental changes. And so process evaluations help us to know what are we evaluating. And then the final thing that they look at is our theory of change model correct? And so if you think that, say, social network interventions or social media interventions, they operate on a specific theory of change, something like diffusions of innovations theory, theory of reasoned action and planned behavior, or the reasoned action approach. These various behavioral change models have some sort of theory about if you do something, then that will elicit some sort of change in an individual, and in turn that will result in an outcome that you're looking for. And so when you're evaluating a process, you want to make sure, well, are we actually doing the intervention the way our theory says that we should? And does that work? Because if you find, we did it exactly according to our theory and still nothing really came of it, then you may have something wrong with your theory. And so that can be important. Now, we talked about last week the many different types of tools at your disposal, things like jurisdictional scans or literature reviews that you could use to help you understand the context of an intervention, what needs to be done, what interventions are best. And in the same way, you could probably use many of those same methods to evaluate processes. That said, process evaluations often focus on the development of indicators. And so these indicators can be collected using qualitative interviews or quantitative surveys. Oftentimes, indicators can be collected based on just reports. So you can imagine, say you're delivering an intervention that's an educational campaign, the report information you might need is just how many sessions did we deliver and to how many people did we deliver them. And that might be enough to measure an aspect of your program and be an indicator. And that you would just, ask the person in charge of the program who of implementing it, say, how many people were in attendance that day, or ask the facilitator. And so So the collection methods, I think, are pretty practical and applied when it comes to process evaluations. But that doesn't mean that we don't use interviews or surveys. You can imagine if you're evaluate a program, one important thing to evaluate is to make sure that the program works well for the people who are implementing it and works well for the people who are receiving it. And so as part of that process evaluation, you might ask them, how do you feel about the program? Is it working for you? Is there something you might want to change? And maybe those informal conversations or formal qualitative interviews might be the best way to conduct that evaluation. Alternatively, maybe you want to use something more large scale in surveys and capture maybe across a large number of people and ask them. And so you could also use surveys. And so later in the course, we talk more about developing qualitative instruments and quantitative instruments. But it should be on your mind at this point that you can use these mixed method approaches or just more basic functional approaches such as reporting from people who operate the program. Now, as we think about indicators, an indicator or a key indicator is merely the thing that you want to capture that will tell you the information you need to understand whether or not the program was implemented. And so they can capture the inputs, which is, what resources are available and are they being distributed as intended. So you can think of, if you're looking at implementing a program that requires nurse hours. So say something like HIV testing. And you say, okay, we're dedicating 40 hours a week, so a full-time nurse to this position, or 35 hours a week, I guess, to this position. That's basically looking at, HIV or STI testing. Now, the process indicator might be, how many hours a week did a nurse actually put into that? Was a nurse available during the shifts and that sort of thing? And so that input of nurse hours would be your indicator. And so indicators measure inputs. They also measure activities. And so if you're delivering an educational intervention, say it's school-based interventions and it's based on presentations to classes, you might say, well, how many presentations to a class were given? And that would be an activity, an indicator for the activity. Similarly, for outputs, you might say, how many people, what was actually, kind of output. That would be the number of people who attended the presentations or something like that. What was the immediate output? We will talk later in the course next week in particular around this distinction between some outcomes, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, which I recognize can be a bit confusing. This has been covered a little bit in the text previously, but outputs really are just the thing that are still part of the program. It's part of the delivery of the program, not necessarily any change in an individual's behavior, which would be an outcome, or not any change in the population prevalence of a specific outcome, which would be an impact. And so, so process indicators measure inputs, activities, and outputs. They'll also look at the mechanisms of action. So you can look at how the inputs impact the planned activities and how the planned activities impact the outcomes. So looking at the links between those. Again, that's harkening back to that idea about the theory of change that we talked about on the last slide. And finally, it will look at controls and timing. So controls are the limitations or the restrictions or constraints that impact a program. So you can imagine that controls on a program's reach might be the ability to, reach people via social media. The control might be some people aren't on social media and therefore you're not reaching them. And so there's lots of things that you can imagine that could influence both internally and externally that could impact your program. Maybe it's the availability of funding, the availability of nursing hours, your ability to hire peer navigators, your ability to train and retain peer navigators. All those sorts of things could be potential controls on your program. And they're important to measure because as you go through an evaluation, you want to understand, well, how did our program get implemented and did it work? A key part of that is going to be answering the question of, if it didn't work, why? What was the difficulty? And finally, we want to think about timing and sequencing of activities. This relates to when specific aspects of a program were delivered. Were they delivered kind of on schedule, kind of as planned, and to kind of make their optimal impact, so this is kind of just a basic programming measure that you want to measure. And so all of these aspects of the program are what you're hoping to measure with an indicator. Now, with each indicator, you're going to want to capture some element of who the population is, or who's going to be involved in that, what you're going to kind of want them to do, when you're going to want them to do it by. And so you can kind of use the who, what, when, where, how method to kind of develop those indicators out for each of those sections. And that's a good strategy. There are lots of frameworks to help you develop those indicators. In the assignment guide, I have provided you with some examples of indicators. Remember, the indicators should be linked back to objectives. And so you can have objectives for your processes, and indicators will help you to measure, to know whether or not that objective was met. And so that's the main purpose of an indicator, really, is to help you know, did we meet our objectives? Now, there are two types of indicators that we are often concerned with in public health and in business kind of operation and management. The first is leading indicators. These are the sorts of things that occur before the kind of theory of action is really at play. So we kind of tend to think of these as a bit preventative. They focus on inputs and activities. And so an example that I have here on the slide is the number of people who had a safe consumption site within 15 minutes of their home, right? Because that's a necessary condition for some other things to occur. And so oftentimes businesses and organizations, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, will focus on lagging indicators, which would be something like the number of people who visited a safe consumption site. But there is an increasing body of research that shows if you actually think about the leading indicator, the thing that will facilitate and drive outputs and outcomes and impacts, that will tend to be a more effective program. And so these leading indicators will help you do that. And then the lagging indicators, as I kind of mentioned, the number of people who visit a safe consumption site, they're kind of the thing that follows afterwards. And so generally we use these to measure outputs. And again, in process evaluation, you're wanting to capture inputs, activities, and outputs. So you should have both lagging and leading indicators. Now, this kind of brings us to our assignment, which I just want to briefly introduce to you. The assignment this week is basically to develop a process indicator matrix. It's to help you to identify and think through some of the parts of conducting a process evaluation. Now, for this assignment, you're really only putting together a table that describes your process evaluation. And in the final assignment, you'll need to provide a bit more detail about how that data is going to be collected. A bit more about the methodology, how you'll sample people and all that sort of thing. That's really what you'll do for the final project. So you can do some of that work now, but all we really want you to do today is we want you to identify 1 to 3 indicators to measure each input, activity, and output that you identified in your logic model. We do require for this assignment that you use a mixed methods assignment. So we want you to think about how you could collect some of that data through interviews or focus groups or participatory methods, as well as the more kind of standard reports and surveys and things that you could use. So you want to develop kind of both sides of that. I think that's important largely because mixed methods are really as the strength. I know there's a lot of dichotomy in people who want to use just qualitative methods or quantitative methods or just participatory methods. But my personal feeling is that you need really both qualitative and quantitative data to provide a convincing evaluation of a program, because there's lots of information that you can't get from a survey, and there's lots of information that really needs to be collected numerically. And so both are important, I think, for this course. And so we do have you do that. I know that may be disappointing to some of you, but hopefully this will be a kind of comfortable way to familiarize yourselves with how to think through both quantitative or qualitative methods, whichever one you're less comfortable with or more comfortable with. you'll have a chance to deal with that in this course. And the latter half of the course is really where we focus on, how to do that qual and quant work. And so the next step in this assignment is for each indicator, I want you to kind of create a definition for the indicator, identify what data source, whether that's an interview, a focus group, is it a focus group or interview with patients or providers, it is a survey of patients or providers, and so on and so forth. Maybe it's a report collected from the program lead. However the case, you need to identify the data source. You need to think through how frequently it will be measured. That's the timing piece we discussed already. And then think through who will be accountable for measuring it and who will they report it to. These are really key characteristics of really planning an evaluation to make sure that it's going to work, because you need to think through, well, who's going to be accountable, because there's that old adage, what gets measured gets done. But that adage is only true if you have somebody assigned to measure it. And so those are kind of the aspects that I want you to include the table, so you can organize that information into a table into step 3. And then step 4, you need to identify an appropriate target value for each indicator. You can search this out, or use your best guess. Hopefully you'll be able to find some published evaluations of your project or similar projects to expect, how much does a Housing First program result in changes to the incidence rate of HIV or something, or how much of a reduction do you expect from a safe consumption side in overdose related incidences. So give a baseline value and then kind of the final expected improvement value, so that you can say, these are what we're hoping to develop out of our indicators. So I guess some of the examples that I gave probably aren't the best for thinking through processes. Those would be more outcomes, wouldn't they? So let me just think through. For processes, you might think of the baseline and the follow-up as being, baseline, how many nursing hours do you have, and follow-up, how many will you need to know that your program has been implemented effectively. Baseline, how many social media posts do you do, follow-up, how many social media posts. So basically it's identifying the targets that you want to achieve. And these, I hope that you'll really think through them to make them realistic, so that as you think through, if I were actually implementing this program, how would I know that my goals were met, that my objectives were achieved? What kind of numeric or other sort of indicators would be there for me? I think that's a little bit jumbled. If you're still feeling a little bit unclear about that, as you might be, then let's chat it out on the discussion boards. And then from there, you can just assign it. You can put that information in citations and footnotes for those estimates, linking that to your table. And then, as I said, you just submit it as a PDF file and then assign a group member to submit it. We'll look at the fact that you identify at least one indicator for each input, activity, and output. That includes the mechanisms of change. I want you to think through those as well. So really hoping that you develop a strong evaluation, that you identify kind of the key elements of those indicators, which are those elements described in step 2. And then also you need to make sure to be identifying both quantitative and qualitatively collected indicators. And then we'll just grade that as we do each of these assignments out of 3. Now, as a little bit of an image, we just provide, let me go back. We just provide you with the table, which you'll provide. This is basically often called a process indicator matrix, and it just provides the indicator, the definition, its data source, how frequent you'll measurement, who will be accountable, and who will they report it to. And so that's the information that you'll need for your process indicator chart. And that's also provided in that kind of outline document at the end of the instructions for the assignment, which I encourage you to read through as you do the assignment. Now, as I kind of mentioned, we mentioned timing a couple times. One important thing that we should think of is the temporal considerations. And so thinking through in developing a program and implementing that program, you need to both think about when will your evaluative components take place. So, you don't want to be trying to do a process evaluation prior to the development of, or the actual, program being implemented. And so you have to align the program timeline with the evaluation timeline to really ensure that there's a good flow and connection between the events that are happening and when they're being measured. And so a Gantt chart is often the way in which this is done, in which Gantt charts, as you kind of see in the textbook, there's an example here, there's another example, but really it just says, if you've got a 5-year program and you divide that into quarters, when are you going to be doing all of the activities that you kind of plan to be doing? And whether that's a program activity or an evaluation activity, you need to be thinking through the timeline of when those things are going to be placed. You need to make sure that that's a feasible kind of timeline, right? You can't be oftentimes conducting a quantitative, qualitative evaluation at the same time. Sometimes you have to stagger those two things. And as you'll learn when we talk about mixed method studies, sometimes you stagger them because you'll use results of maybe a qualitative study to inform the development of a quantitative study, or you'll use results from a quantitative study or qualitative study to tell you what the quantitative results mean or how they can be best be interpreted. And so so you'll develop, not this week, but in a future assignment, a Gantt chart for your thing, for your evaluation. But I just wanted to introduce it basically here because it is an important component of the process evaluation. Because it's, I think, most directly when you connect the activities of your evaluation to the activities of your program. And so a number of things you'll want to consider as you do that is consider whether or not you're trying to measure change in something. This is, again, a little bit more applicable to outcome and impact factors because you're often looking at change in effectiveness of a specific intervention on a specific outcome of interest, something like heart incidence of heart disease or time in the hospital, or any number of things that you can think of that are health related states or events. You'll want to think through how frequently those reports will be delivered or tracked. In kind of thinking through that, you want to make sure that you're not being a burden on the organization who is conducting the intervention or the other many busy people who are involved. So you don't necessarily need to collect information at a rate that is burdensome, and so you want to think about the frequency, but you also want to make sure that when you collect that information, it's still valid, and that the data collected as part of that is still valid. And then thinking over just the overall timing of when is it best and most convenient to interview and survey to give you the best information that you need to make decisions about your program and to collect that good information. In addition to timing considerations, there are also theoretical considerations. As I mentioned before, a key part of the process evaluation is to evaluate whether or not the theory that you have used to develop an intervention, whether that's an individual theory or an interpersonal theory or community theory, that theory is being captured in the types of things that you are measuring. And so if you're doing stages of change or theory of planned behavior or health belief model, maybe a lot of the ways you collect maybe a lot of the things you collect from an individual, from participants in your programs will be the same, but maybe there are key differences that you want to capture. This is really big when you have something like a community level theory where your theory is based on like diffusions of innovation, in which maybe you will need to measure completely different things. If your intervention is a social media based intervention, diffusions of innovation theory will definitely change how you evaluate the process. It'll make you want to look at how far did our message go? Did it reach the right people? Did kind of a strong early cohort of early adopters adopt the intervention or the information associated with the intervention, and so on and so forth. And so whatever kind of theory is driving, a lot of the activities for your assignment will be driven by individual or interpersonal theories of change. But certainly in public health, increasingly so, community level, structural level interventions are being used as means to influence and change behavior. And so adapting your methods to evaluate those outcomes is essential. Now in the textbook, I mentioned 2 frameworks, and these are frameworks that I want you to spend some time exploring because I think they're very useful, and they're also really becoming the gold standard. I think rather than just regurgitate to you what's in the textbook or just to give an outright description of these, I think really the best thing for you to do is to go to the websites. Both of these resources have super well developed websites and resources and ways to develop interventions based on these, evaluations of interventions based on these. So visit cferguide.org to kind of learn more about the consolidated framework for implementation research. Now, I will briefly just say that the CFIR is kind of based on these 5 factors of implementation. It makes you look at the characteristics of an intervention, the kind of inner setting. So what is the culture? What are the factors within your organization that are going to influence your intervention? The outer setting, so maybe that's peer pressure on your participants. Maybe that's patient needs and trouble getting access to your setting. Maybe it's a politician who doesn't like your intervention, and so they try to cut funding from it, all those sort of things. That's the outer setting. Then there's the characteristics of the individuals involved. That's bound to impact whether or not that's of the providers or of the people who are the targets of your intervention. And then the actual implementation process. And so CFIR really just gives you this broad framework of things to think about. Now, not every intervention is necessarily going to need an evaluation that looks at all of these components. This is why one of the questions that you'll need to address in your evaluation proposal is what things need to be evaluated, because maybe you're not so interested in outer setting, maybe you're not so interested in inner setting, maybe you're just really interested in characteristics of the intervention and the individuals involved. But CFIR really calls our attention to think about those kind of broad outputs as well. And so you might at this point go back and add a few objectives to think through. Maybe you need an objective to understand changes to the outer setting or to the inner setting as a result of your intervention. And so if you're implementing a new intervention around cultural safety in a hospital setting, definitely your evaluation should look at the inner setting and how it's interacting with things like the outer setting and the individuals involved. Maybe people have prejudices, or maybe it's based on their own identities and those sort of things that could impact how successfully the intervention is developed and received in your sample. And so those are kind of the 5 key aspects of the consolidated framework. Do go visit that website, explore the website, learn what you can. I want you to feel like when you finish this activity, I want you to feel like you're now an expert on CFIR. And so really spend some time with that. That's why today's lecture and other lectures tend to be a bit short, because I really believe that learning by fire is much more effective than me delivering kind of rote presentations and that sort of thing. So do that. I can't kind of underestimate the importance of doing that. That'll really help you in thinking through your indicators. It'll really help you through planning your evaluation. And not to mention, it will help you become familiar with one of the most widely and increasingly widely used frameworks for evaluation and implementation science research. Same with the REAIM framework. The reaim.org website is also fantastic. Now, REAIM also focuses on 5 things. It's not so much quite the same 5 things as we look at in the CFIR model. So oftentimes you'll see like REAIM and CFIR being used complementary to evaluate different components of an intervention. Maybe the implementation is used as part of the process evaluation for CFIR, but then REAIM is used for your outcome evaluation, because REAIM really wants to look at whether or not the program reaches its audience, whether it was effective in producing the changes that you had hoped it would change, whether it was acceptable and adopted by the host organization, so the sponsor, whether it was implemented properly and whether it was maintained. Did it have scale up? Is it going to stick around? Or after we do it or after funding gets cut, is it just going to disappear? And so REAIM really helps you think through what parts of the program do we want to evaluate to make sure that it is a efficacious program, and efficacious in terms of not only did it produce the change, but the many important factors that play a role in whether or not an organization chooses to stick with a specific intervention. And REAIM, again, widely used, widely validated. Strongly encourage you to visit the reaim.org website to learn more about REAIM. There's also information in the textbook, so you should have a bit of a primer, a bit of an understanding of kind of the REAIM framework. Just two kind of final thoughts. I've already pressed enough on telling you to go and learn through those websites. I do want to emphasize, though, that CFR and REAIM, being implementation frameworks, are super useful for process evaluations, but they really go beyond the scope of a process evaluation and are really an entire implementation framework. Implementation frameworks really try to break down the barrier between program planning, program evaluation, and say, we're looking at this all as an implementation project. As such, when you think about how you will integrate CFR and REAIM into your work, I want you to adopt the frameworks to your needs. Don't just follow them blindly, but take the constituent parts. Think about outer and inner network, if that's something that you're interested in, the outer and inner setting. Then use those components. But you don't necessarily need to use everything just because you've learned something. Sometimes it's a bit of a take what works for you in theory. And so that's how I encourage you to use the theory as kind of as a smorgasbord of picking what's going to work for your program. This is both for the sake of the assignment and in real life. Most of evaluations that I've planned or been a part of definitely will take components from interventions, or from frameworks, and maybe use 2 or 3 frameworks, or maybe even use scales and measures developed as part of other frameworks, and just plug them in to kind of my existing frameworks. And so don't treat frameworks like they're rigid and that you have to follow every aspect of it. Be careful in thinking about which aspects are going to best fit with your program and best evaluate and achieve the goals of your sponsor in the evaluation. And this is also true when thinking about working with stakeholders. Make sure that you consult with them and make sure that you're measuring the things that not just CFR or REAIM care about, but that you're measuring the things that your stakeholders care about. And that's basically process evaluations. And so next week, we will talk about outcome evaluations, talk about the outcome indicators and matrix, and we're also going to have a check-in to see how things are working in the course, what's working for you, what's not, and see what we can maybe mix up to change to make things work better. And so that midterm evaluation check-in will also be next week. And I look forward to answering your questions on the discussion board, whether it's about the assignment or the course content. I also look forward to having you guys share. I know people seem to have been a bit reticent to share their own stories or experience, but I think it would enhance your learning greatly to hear stories and experiences on these types of things like process evaluations from your colleagues in the class. I know it would certainly help improve my understanding and my appreciation for the content as well, to have some of those rich live examples from those of you. So if you have experience, feel free to share it on the discussion boards that are associated with each week's content. I know that without requiring it as part of your grade, that it might be hard to elicit that sort of participation. But I do encourage it, and I would greatly appreciate your continued involvement. Anyhow, things are going great in the course. I hope that you feel that way. Your assignments have been really a pleasure to look over, and you've really put in a lot of work. I sent out kind of an announcement to that effect, but also wanted to say it here in the lecture. And so with that, hope all things are well with you, and enjoy this week's learning experience.